Now, again, I went on this kind of literary tour that I was launched into after reading what my buddy wrote, because it reminded me of so many other things that I've heard and so many other things that I've read. And so another great, viewpoint comes from Eugene Sledge, and he wrote the book With the Old Breed, which is a classic. And we covered it, podcast number 10. If you want to stop now, go back and listen to podcast 10 with Eugene Sledge, with the Old Breed. It's just incredible account of what he went through in World War II in the Pacific Theater with the Marine Corps. But he wrote another book after that, and the next book that he wrote was called China Marine. And it talks about what they did when the war ended, and the time he spent sort of pacifying and in country, spent some time in China, and then it talks about what it was like when he got back to America, back to Mobile, Alabama. And it's definitely impactful. So here's what he came home to, and I'm going to pick up where he's talking to his dad, and his dad was a physician during World War I. And that's one of the reasons his dad was, if you remember, Eugene Sledge couldn't get in the Marine Corps at first because I think he had a heart murmur or something like that. And so they didn't let him in. And his dad was kind of okay with that. And the reason he was okay with that was because he had seen what the boys from World War I had come home like, not only physically, but also psychologically. Guys had the shell shock, which is horrible when you see it. And again, I've said this before, go on YouTube and look at videos of World War I's shell shock. It's horrifying to look at. And that's what Eugene Sledge's father had seen. And so when his son couldn't go in the Marine Corps, he was kind of like, oh, okay, you can serve in other ways. And Eugene Sledge wanted to serve. And so Eugene Sledge he actually got a waiver, and I guess the heart murmur had faded enough, or they didn't notice it until he got in the Marine Corps. But when he comes back, his dad is talking to him, and I think it's a good place to pick up. His dad called him Fritz. That was Eugene Sledge's nickname at home. So here we go. Eugene Sledge's dad talking to him. Fritz, he said, I know you've been through an awful experience. I know that nobody had it worse than the 1st Marine Division, except maybe those on Bataan and those others who were imprisoned. I'm tremendously proud of both you and Edward. You did your duty under terrifying conditions, but you survived in one piece, granted with some terrible memories you'll have to learn to live with. But take my advice. First, never become embittered because many other men had safe, comfortable war assignments, all too often obtained through political influence. That's the way of cowards in this world. 2, never feel sorry for yourself because of what you endured. On the contrary, feel fiercely proud that you served with the finest and fought against the fiercest enemy and lived to tell the tale. 3, if you ever drink alcohol, do it in moderation. Alcohol can be a wonderful escape from bad memories, but it is addictive, will make you act the fool, and ultimately ruin you. To the last remark, I replied, I know, Father, I've seen that happen to good buddies, recalling some of the worst cases in China. He replied, yes, and I've treated some of the nicest people who were ruined by the stuff. But I can't cure them. They must have willpower. So, really straightforward warning about alcohol, check. About not feeling bitter towards people that didn't maybe do or go through what he went through, and be proud of what you did. Now, this is, again, just another piece that they actually, in the HBO miniseries The Pacific, they kind of portray this part of Eugene Sledge coming home. but it's worth reading his account of it. Back to the book. As my life settled down somewhat, I began to think of my future. Rather hastily, I decided to go to Auburn, then called Alabama Polytechnic Institute, and major in business. I'll never forget my first day at Auburn. I was in the registrar's office in Sanford Hall. The big room was crowded with long lines of entering students standing in front of tables behind which clerks were noting each student's college credits from service schools, determining which might transfer to Auburn. There was a loud hubbub of voices with about 100 people in the room. Some men, mostly Air Corps veterans, had been to various technical schools, and Auburn gave them 2 years credit. All veterans were excused from ROTC and physical education. When I stepped up to the table at the head of the line, a pretty brunette about my age, probably a student's wife, asked pleasantly what schools I had attended in the Marine Corps. I recited all the weapons and tactics schools we had in training. She became more and more disconcerted as she looked in vain on her checklist for anything remotely resembling what I was saying. Finally, in desperation, she slammed her pencil on the table and said in a loud, exasperated voice, "Didn't the Marine Corps teach you anything?" A gasp ran through the crowd, and you could have heard a pin drop. I didn't lose my temper, but I realized that, like most civilians, war to this lady meant John Wayne or the sweet musical South Pacific. Slowly placing my hands on the table, aware that all eyes were upon us, I said in a loud, calm voice, "Lady, there was a killing war. The Marine Corps taught me how to kill Japs and try to survive. Now, if that don't fit into any academic course, I'm sorry, but some of us had to do the killing. And most of my buddies got killed or wounded." She was speechless. There were many red faces among the obvious non-combatants present. I doubt if there were half a dozen infantrymen or tankers present. She recovered her composure, looked me in the eye, and said, "I'm so sorry. I apologize. I didn't understand." I told her she was very kind and I did not mean to upset her. "You didn't," she said. "You made me think." So I got credit for ROTC and PE, and the room returned to normal. The young lady wished me a long and happy life. I thanked her and left. I felt like some sort of an alien, and I realized that this sort of thing would confront me the rest of my days. The war had been so momentous to me, I couldn't imagine anyone not sharing that view or appreciating the hell I had suffered. In fact, I was totally unprepared for how rapidly most Americans who did not experience combat would forget about the war, the evils we faced, and how incredibly tough it had been for us to defeat the Japanese and the Nazis. I didn't realize how swiftly most Americans would once again take their freedom for granted. Clearly, that applies to veterans and people that have been overseas fighting, and you come back and it's like no one even knows that you were gone.
Yeah.
It's like another thing, you get that passage of time when you go away for 2 or 3 months and you go back to where you're from, and it seems like, oh, how long you been gone for? Oh, 3 months. Oh, it seems people think you were gone for a couple days or a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it happens at the gym.
Yep.
Like, I'll go into the gym and someone else, "Oh, where you been?" I think I haven't seen him in a week. And he says, "Oh, I tore my ACL. I've been gone for 8 months. Mm-hmm. It's one of those moments, and that happens with war too. Guys go away, they come back, time just went by. Mm-hmm. And that can be frustrating because in those 8 months or 6 months or 14 months that someone's deployed overseas fighting for their lives, and they come home and that other person didn't even notice they were gone.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel bad when somebody had an ACL tear and I didn't know it. I feel kind of bad.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen you for 8 months. I feel like I feel bad about it. And I'm sure that person's saying, Jocko, geez, we used to train all the time, and you didn't even realize that I was gone. You thought I was gone for a week, right?
Doesn't mean anything.
Kind of exactly. Yeah. Well, imagine how that feels to a veteran that's coming back from war. And this isn't like some odd case. This is the norm. That's actually the norm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's different for the direct family that's waiting for the individual to come home. Then those 6-month deployments or 14 months deployments seem like an eternity.
Yeah.
But for that casual person or that acquaintance that you don't know that well, they're thinking, oh, did you, where you been?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was overseas fighting.
Yeah.
And he's got the way he kind of wraps up this book in his epilogue. And again, this is another book that we'll probably explore at some point in detail, but going to the way the topics that he brings up as he closes it out and reflections on how the war impacted him psychologically. Here we go back to the book. Looking back over the momentous events of 50 years ago when I was a Marine evokes strong emotions. The years immediately after the war were the hardest. As Paul Fussell remarked, the combat veteran not only has to survive his experience, he has to learn to live with it the rest of his life. He was so right. For the first 20-odd years after my return, nightmares occurred frequently, waking me either crying or yelling, always sweating, and with a pounding heart. Some nights I delayed going to bed, dreading the inevitable nightmares. Old comrades wrote me that similar troubles drove many of them to drink and to the ensuing misery of alcoholism, which they beat with sheer self-discipline. Eventually, the war left me with a deep appreciation for the simple things in life. Putting on a clean pair of dry socks is one of the greatest luxuries I know. A shave, a warm shower, and sleeping in a sheeted bed are too. When it is raining, especially on an autumn day, I look out the window at the falling drops, and my thoughts sometimes drift back to those awful days on Okinawa. Snafu and I bailing out a muddy foxhole with an old helmet, shivering in a torrential cold rain. And both of us cringing as each Japanese shell came screaming into the corpse-strewn area to explode with a deafening crash. I quickly bring the focus of my mind back to the present, and thank God I didn't have to suffer hardship and misery again. And oh, what a blessing to be relieved of constant terror. My love of the outdoors was strangely affected by the war. The way I looked at my surroundings was altered. My view of the outdoors had taken a more analytical perspective of its features as military terrain, likely areas for the placement of various foxholes, the company's 60mm mortars to cover defilades, the light machine guns so as to achieve crossfires along the company front, fields of fire, and possible avenues of enemy attack or ambush. This change in outlook was intense in the early years home, but I cleared my mind of it by concentrating on plant and animal species present or probable. But the old combat view of things still creeps in sometimes after more than 50 years. And that's something that definitely sticks. Every guy I know that's been overseas, everything we look at, we see it as some kind of military terrain. In the city, for me, especially it's in the city because I did most of my combat was urban combat, and that's what I'm looking at all the time, not only on the highway, on the buildings, when you're sitting around, when you're sitting in a hotel room looking out in the street, everything that you look at from a combat perspective. Now, he was a outdoorsman, and he gets back from the war, and he's going hunting. And this is the first time that he's gone deer hunting after the war. And he's out hunting with a group of people, but he gets dropped off in one spot by himself. They have a boat. It's by a river. They take a boat. They drop him off alone. And here we go back to the book. 2 beautiful does appeared, walking briskly through the water as they exited the woods and stopped at the far edge of the pond about 30 yards away. They kept looking toward the area of the drive and moving their ears to capture every sound possible. More loud sloshing of water, and 2 does and a large buck came up to the first does and stopped. They finally looked in my direction. I remained still, and since the wind was blowing toward me, the deer could not pick up my scent. They stood motionless, staring at me and standing up in the clump of cane. They seemed more concerned with the baying of the hounds than with me, though. Because of the way I held my rifle, I could see my wristwatch, so I timed the action, or inaction, of the deer. One of the does picked up an acorn at the edge of the pond and ate it. The buck was large and had a fine set of antlers, the 8 points gleaming in the light. Slowly I raised my rifle and sighted in on his chest. No, he was too fine a creature to kill. I had murdered one of his kind that morning, so I did not need the venison. Slowly I lowered my rifle. The buck remained motionless. His instincts probably told him no shape such as he saw in the cane was natural. Deer, like most mammals, have very poor sight, except for detecting motion, and are primarily colorblind. For 15 minutes we stared at each other. A shot in the air would send them springing away into the woods, but a shot would frighten them, which I had no desire to do. The deer seemed more curious than afraid. They kept sniffing the air, which apparently bore no scent of danger. I had on waterproof boots, but was beginning to get cold. Finally, I needed to move a little. I knew that as soon as I did, they would bolt. So I whistled softly. Every big ear turned quickly in my direction. I whistled softly again. All the deer slowly lowered their ears, turned, went sloshing onto higher ground, and ambled into the woods, looking back at me once or twice. The whole episode is one of my most cherished memories. When Jim picked me up on the boat, he asked if I had seen a deer. I said no, not wanting to tell him I had seen 5. When we returned to camp, several people asked me what I had seen, and I reported a few squirrels and some wood ducks. If I had told those eager hunters what had really happened, they would have elected to throw me in the river. Gus didn't allow any drinking during hunting hours, so after the guns were all unloaded and put in their cases, the bottled spirits were brought forth, and the partiers all had a ball. Each of the weary hounds went to the fenced yard, jumped up on the raised platforms, and went into the barrel for a nap. The platform was raised as protection against high water, as well as alligators, which have a special appetite for dog flesh. We recrossed the river after a while and scattered to our homes. So ended my last deer hunt, with the memory of that beautiful buck and his harem down the river. I have wondered how long he survived. I am not anti-hunting as long as it is managed by wildlife experts. Most game animals outproduce their food supply, and since civilization has destroyed most of the natural predators, starvation results unless populations are controlled by game management overseeing proper hunting practices. But the terrified eyes of that spike buck I shot are something I'd like to forget. I have felt the same terror when being shot at, so hunting is not for me. World War II gave me a convenient measuring stick for duty, courage, terror, friendship, patience, horror, endurance, compassion, discomfort, grief, and pain that has remained with me daily. The English poet Robert Graves said World War I affected him in much the same way. Anyone who has not suffered the prolonged fear and limitless fatigue that was the combat infantryman's lot might find this difficult to comprehend. Over 50 years later, I look back on the war as though it were some giant killing machine into which we were thrown to endure fear to the brink of insanity. Some fell over the brink, and physical fatigue to near collapse. Those who survived unhurt will never forget and cannot forget the many friends lost in their prime and the many articles of civilization they ruthlessly destroyed. As I look back, some facts are quite clear. Japan's sneak bombing of Pearl Harbor destroyed many American lives, ships, and planes. We had no choice but to destroy Imperial Japan. The A-bomb ended that war. It saved millions of American lives by preventing a murderous invasion of Japan and the probable destruction of a suicidal Japanese population. The Japanese soldier was a bloodthirsty foe imbued with the code of Bushido. If we had not defeated an army that thought it was unbeatable, who knows how many American cities might have shared the horrid rape of Nanking. In looking back, I'm still amazed I escaped the killing machine. Why I never fell killed or wounded in that storm of steel thrown at us countless times still astonishes me. I'm proud of the number of the enemy I fired on and hit with my mortar, rifle, or Tommy gun, and regret the ones I missed. There is no mellowing for me. That would be to forgive all the atrocities the Japanese committed against millions of Asians and thousands of Americans. To mellow is to forget. Each man who survived, I am certain, was plucked from the mire of death by the Almighty. And in this, I feel humble and grateful. Socrates said, "Know thyself." I do. The war taught me. The war taught me, is how he closes out that book.